Now, of course, if you make all of these ridiculously negative assumptions, then leaving the EU, of course, looks awful. And the irony here is that the Treasury's own scaremongering is precisely the thing that's likely to lead to the short-term shock if people expect that it's going to be a disaster for us to leave. But would we really adopt such self-harming policy if we left? What the Remain side are in essence saying, I think, is that our electorate would make dumb decisions, and that the risks to staying in the EU do not matter. Whether this is a groupthink or a deceit, I'll let you decide. Now, the Prime Minister once said that if we were to leave the EU, Britain wouldn't be a land of milk and honey. And for once, I agree with him. I don't believe that we have comparative advantage in production of either of those two products. But what I would say is, I believe there are 7 major advantages that are often overlooked in the long term. And I say the long term because leaving the EU, we've been in it for 43 years, leaving the EU would be very much a process and not an event. But in the long term, I think there are 7 major advantages to leaving. First, as we've already heard, leaving would enable us to actually expand free trade. There is lots of evidence that smaller countries such as Switzerland and Singapore are much nimbler at signing free trade deals with huge markets than the EU. Switzerland, as we've heard, has free trade deals with China and Japan, ones the EU does not yet have. And in fact, we often hear about the EU having 50-plus trade deals, but with the exception of ones with Mexico, South Korea and South Africa, the rest of them are trivial with tiny, tiny countries. Dealing with 28 different member states' interests, the EU is slow and cumbersome at getting things done. And I believe that the UK, acting alone, would act more swiftly and get more trade deals that better suit our service sector needs. In fact, we could go further. We could use our power from leaving the EU as an opportunity to actually embrace full-blown unilateral free trade, abolishing all import tariffs that the EU currently imposes on our behalf. The EU is a customs union. It raises the prices of agricultural manufacturing goods by raising the cost of importing things from outside of the EU. This also distorts the production side of our economy. And economists have looked at this and found that abolishing this common external tariff, in essence moving to unilateral free trade, could actually lower the prices that we all face in the shops by 8%. Second, we could finally regain our seats on top regulatory tables, such as the World Trade Organization. As we've already heard tonight, Britain is a liberal, free trading nation. Rather than using our voice to try and fight against Romanian visa requests and all of these other debates that we're having in trade deals, why not be at the top table where real important trade regulations are being made, making that liberal case instead of being represented by 1/28 of an EU representative? Third, we could actually save some money. We're huge net contributors to the EU budget to the tune of £8.5 billion, as we've heard, and that money could be used to cut taxes or increase spending on public services, whilst we still protect, at least in transition, because we might want to reassess in future, all of the groups that currently benefit from EU spending. Fourth, we could exit, finally, the hated common agricultural and common fisheries policies, the former of which would reduce prices for UK consumers on food, whilst the latter would allow us to reclaim our territorial rights over fishing waters, enable us to provide a reviving fishing industry. Fifth, we could set regulations according to our own needs. Now, the other side likes to say, well, this is all about deregulation of reducing workers' rights, but it's not about that. It's about having the flexibility to reassess expensive energy policies, the ability to avoid unnecessary EU harmonisation of things like regulation of ports that we've seen recently that would have been very detrimental to the UK, or to get out of things like the Clinical Trials Directive that deters innovation and the testing of cancer drugs. Sixth, we can finally set our own immigration policy. No longer would we have the bizarre situation where we have an open border with countries just because they're near us, and then impose very, very strict controls on the rest of the world, irrespective of what migrants we're talking about. And seventh, Professor Lindley-French mentioned that there's no push for an EU federal state, but there's certainly a push, or will be a push if they want to save their currency, towards some sort of Euro federal state. And actually, paradoxically, us leaving the European Union would allow the Eurozone to more easily get on with the reforms that they need in terms of governance in order to solve their own crisis. But don't take my word for it. A survey of EU economists said Brexit would actually improve the Eurozone's medium-term growth prospects, precisely for that reason. That would, of course, be good for us too. So as you can see, if you ignore all 7 of these, what I consider quite key long-term advantages, then perhaps it's not a surprise that the Treasury and others produce a highly biased view of the impact of Brexit. Now, the Prime Minister responds to these arguments, and I don't know how many of you watched him on Sky last night, by just banging on again and again and again about the single market. What is the single market? In fact, it would be better named a single regulatory zone. It's about using the excuse of the need for levelling the playing field to harmonise more and more things, from employment regulation through product regulation and much else in between, and have that overseen by the European Court of Justice. In effect, it's developing a political union with a zeal for more centralisation and the elimination of diversity and being able to set things in the interests of local areas. Now, people talk about having access to the single market as though there's some sort of room with a door which you may or may not be admitted, depending on showing your EU membership card. But that, of course, is nonsense. All countries in the world have access to the single market. It's simply that in order to sell goods to it, you have to meet the regulations and standards required. But that's true wherever you sell goods. And as it happens, plenty of countries around the world have had great success, even more success in increasing their export growth into the single market without themselves being EU members. The US is the largest exporter to the EU, exporting more to the EU than does the UK, followed by China. As for the importance of being able to influence EU rules, you might have noticed that neither of those countries currently has any influence on them at all. The simple truth is, you don't need to be in a political union to trade. But there are costs of the single market too. The downside of belonging to the single market is, as we've heard, you must apply all its rules and regulations throughout the whole economy. In the UK's case, that means that whilst only 10 to 15% of our GDP is accounted for by exports to the EU, the other 85 and 90% to 90% all have to obey the EU's rules too. And this is going to only become more costly for 2 reasons. Because the proportion of our total exports going to the EU is going to fall and fall and fall, whilst, as we know with governments of any persuasion, whether it be Westminster or Brussels, the degree of regulation becomes ever more prevalent. And ask yourself these simple questions. If the single market is so good for growth and jobs, and it is the single market and it is the EU that is so vital, why do so many states in the single market see such high rates of unemployment? And why has the EU's growth performance been so pitiful, even in comparison to other developed countries like the United States? The advantages of the single market, it seems to me, are vastly overplayed. And that's not to mention the risks of staying in. As the Eurozone integrates further, the EU institutions will be used more and more to prop up the single currency. The 5 Presidents report that was mentioned in the previous speech often talks about this sort of stuff that's governance reform that's going to be necessary to save the euro occurring within the EU institutions. And that risks Britain being outvoted by a Eurozone bloc of countries acting in their homogenous interests. There's also likely, as a result of that, to be a desire for a larger EU budget, because in comparison to many political entities, governmental entities around the world, the EU budget is comparatively small as a proportion of total EU GDP. Again, in order to save the single currency, it's likely that transfers and things like that are going to be necessary, and that's going to lead to a demand for more EU funds. So can we really guarantee that Britain won't face demand for higher contributions in the future? There have already been plans outlined for further harmonisation of employment law, bankruptcy and company law. Is it really in Britain's interest to harmonise these things with countries whose labour markets are so dire as Greece and Spain? And major industries such as the city face the threat of damaging regulation being imposed upon them, like the financial transactions tax. So let's conclude. There are risks and opportunities of staying and leaving. The key question I think you should all be asking is what governmental structures are most likely to give us the best chance of prosperity over future generations. The Treasury and others simply assume we make bad decisions on trade and regulation and spending, whilst ignoring the huge risks of remaining. But provided we set sensible policy outside the EU, as we've seen, it's clear we have nothing to fear. Many independent countries operate successfully outside of the European Union. Being a member of the European Union is clearly neither necessary nor sufficient for economic success. So when making a decision, I'd urge you to ignore the scaremongering and actually listen to the arguments and assumptions that both sides make. When you do that, I think you come to this conclusion. You realise this economic debate is really about your faith in politics. If you think a system of democratic government will produce better policy and correct your mistakes more quickly by being able to kick out governments and reverse policies when we get things wrong, then vote leave. If you think the Brussels institutions and the bureaucrats are better placed to make economic decisions on behalf of all of the people across the European Union, vote remain. But I know which I have more confidence in, and that's why I'm voting leave on the 23rd of June.
For strongly putting the economic case for Brexit. Finally, we're going to hear from Charles Grant, who is director of a leading European Union think tank, the Centre for European Reform. Charles.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm probably more pro-EU than the other panellists tonight, a little bit more pro than Julian, but I can tell you in Brussels, where I used to be the Economist correspondent long ago, I'm regarded as a Eurosceptic because I'm not a federalist and I don't believe in giving more power to EU institutions. But I defend most of the powers they have today. Before I get into my own remarks, just one of my 10 minutes, I'll say a little bit about something that Anna said. Firstly, just Cameron never talked about World War III. I've read the speech. The press reports of him, the briefings by Vote Leave said he didn't talk about World War III, so be fair to the man. However, there are other mistakes he's made. 60% of our laws do not come from the EU. I've seen the House of Commons library data. It can be 7 or 15%, depending on the definition. To get up to 6, you have to make some really extraordinary assumptions. As for the Open Europe, you quoted the cost of regulations being £33 billion a year. You didn't quote the fact that the benefits of those regulations, they reckon, were 50-something billion a year. They've said that even if we leave the EU, we'd only save 12 billion. I mean, think about it. Would you really get rid of all the EU regulations on drinking water, bathing water quality, air quality, all the financial regulations that keep the city going and so on? And I don't think many of them will actually go in practice health and safety. And as for the fact that the EU is unable to get trade deals, this also applies to sort of what you both said. I mean, the EU has recently negotiated trade deals with Canada, with Singapore, with Vietnam, with Thailand. It's done pretty well. It's got 53, and there's many more in the pipeline. So the EU has a pretty creditable record there. The 5 presidents' report you